All right. Well, I think we have a lot to do tonight, and we should probably get started. And thank you to those of you who've joined right on time. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm the founder of the Parent Education Series and co-founder with Bev Hartman of the Parent Venture, a nonprofit organization. We could not be more delighted to have with us tonight Laura Huang, who's the author of Edge, Turning Adversity into Advantage. This is a great new best-selling book, and we couldn't be happier to have her with us tonight. So before we get started, just a few logistics and details. If you would like Spanish interpretation, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a globe icon. If you click on the globe and then Spanish, Cynthia Hinestrosa will be offering simultaneous Spanish interpretation. So again, if you need Spanish, click on the globe icon and then Spanish. With more than 300 registered for tonight's presentation, we know that this is an important and timely topic. As Laura said, when she was writing Edge, she hadn't counted on a pandemic as an adversity that we would all be living through, but certainly she will touch on that tonight with her experiences. This event tonight is sponsored by Karl Marx PTSA, Sequoia Union High School District, Sequoia Healthcare District, Peninsula Healthcare District, and the Parent Venture. Special thanks to all of you for this evening, and special thanks to you, Dr. Huang, for being with us tonight. So Laura is going to offer about 35 minutes of content, followed by Q&A. So we really want to hear from you, the audience. Again, at the bottom of your screen, tonight is a webinar. So if you would, in the chat section, feel free to make comments to us, ask questions. You will see links from Bev in there with references to the book and other programs. And at the end, there will be a survey link. If you have questions, we ask that you put those in the Q&A button. So questions in the Q&A button, try to keep them kind of short if you would, because we want to get to as many of your questions as possible. Tonight's event will be recorded and available soon on our video library. This is a resource we started a couple years ago, and we've now had close to 17,000 views, including 15,000 views since COVID. So we know that these parent education programs are really important resources for you, parents, and community members. Upcoming events tomorrow at 5:30, Thursday, April 22nd, we have Helping Your Child or Teen Safely Navigate the Online World. This event is in Spanish with Cynthia Marroquin from RTS. And on Friday, April 23rd at 12 noon, again, Pacific Daylight Time, we have Understanding Mental Health, When to Worry and How to Help with Caroline Mendel, clinical psychologist from the Child Mind Institute. So let me tell you a little bit about tonight's featured speaker. Laura Huang is a professor at the Harvard Business School, a former assistant professor at Wharton, and the international best-selling author of Edge, Turning Adversity into Advantage. Her new book, Edge, examines how hard work alone is not always enough, because success and outcomes are often determined by signals, perceptions, and stereotypes. She describes how we can flip these perceptions and stereotypes in our favor to improve our chances of being successful in life. Her works have been featured in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, USA Today, Forbes, and Nature. She was named one of the 40 best business school professors under the age of 40, and she's a recipient of the Thinkers 50 Radar Class of 2021. Huang is also co-founder of Project EMplify, a nonprofit that teaches soft or foundational skills to underprivileged communities. She holds an MS and BSc in electrical engineering from Duke University, an MBA from INSEAD, and a PhD from the University of California at Irvine. Please join me in a really warm virtual welcome for Laura Huang. Take it away, Laura. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlene. Thank you, Charlene and Bev, for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here with all of you today to be talking about my recent book, Edge, Turning Adversity into Advantage. As Charlene sort of mentioned, when I was writing the book, I didn't sort of anticipate the type of adversity that we would all have been facing for this past year, but it certainly applies, in so many of the principles that I talk about not only apply to adversity in terms of this pandemic that we face as parents, that our children and our students are sort of facing. So I want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about how do we think about obstacles and constraints and adversity, and more importantly, how do we think about the sort of how do we turn that adversity around? How do we think about those opportunities that might still exist? How do we think about gaining an advantage or even gaining our own unique edge over the course of what we might be grappling with? So again, thank you for joining us today. So I want to give a really quick story, a personal story, to talk a little bit about this, some of the things that Charlene mentioned in terms of my research, in terms of the findings that I've had, in terms of what went into this book and the reasons for sort of writing this. And this is a story of myself as a student in high school, where I had, I was a product of the public school system, where I had some of my teachers, I had multiple years, right? Because there wasn't enough teachers to kind of go around. So we had some teachers for, 2-3 years at a time. And there was one particular teacher that I adored. He was my math teacher. And I had him for 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade. And math was something that I had always loved. It was something that I was always good at. It was something that I always loved. And for those of you who are rolling your eyes at me right now, you have to give me this, because I wasn't really good at anything as a child growing up. I wasn't musical. I wasn't athletic. I was painfully shy. Didn't have a lot of friends. So math was one of the only things that I actually was good at. It felt like it was organized, that it was predictable, that I could do it. And so I adored this teacher. And the thing that this teacher would do is that he had this thing where if you got a perfect test paper, a 100%, and it had to be a test, it couldn't be a quiz. If you had a perfect test paper, you got a 100%, he would give you a gold star. But this just wasn't any gold star. This was the mother of all gold stars. This was like 12 inches by 12 inches. He would wrap it meticulously in gold foil, and he would stencil your name on this star, making it look like it was almost engraved in this star. And then he would put it right above the blackboard for the rest of the school year for everyone to sort of see. So it would have your name on it, the date that you got that perfect test paper, and it would be put right on top of the blackboard. And in any given year, there would maybe only be 5 or 6 of these stars. And so, even being someone who loved math, it was my goal. I so wanted one of these gold stars. And I came close a couple of times my 9th grade year, my freshman year. I came close a couple of times my sophomore year, but never got one of these gold stars. And then it was my junior year, and it was sort of getting towards the end of this school year. And I was like so determined to get one of these gold stars because it was one of the last tests. And so I studied so hard for this exam. I put in so much hard work, so much effort. I knew the material so well. I had it down cold that I was convinced that I would take this test and I would be able to get one of these gold stars. So I took this test, felt really, really good about it. And then I got the test paper back a couple of days later, and I looked at the top of it. And at the top of it, it said 99. So I scanned through the test paper really, really quickly to see what had sort of happened. And at the one of the last sort of problems, it reduced to the equation sort of reduced to something that was like 2x equals 14. And I wrote x equals 7. And I saw a -1 next to it. So I went up to this teacher and I asked him, I said, oh, like, help me understand, like, how did I lose a point here? Very politely sort of asking this teacher. And he said, well, you just wrote x equals 7. You should have wrote x equals 14 over 2, and then x equals 7. You didn't show all of your work. And so I sort of went back to my desk and I looked over at someone sitting next to me, this girl who had already gotten 4 stars that year. And I looked over at her test paper and I saw on that last problem, she had written 2x equals 14, x equals 7. and she had gotten a 100% and gotten that gold star. And I remember in that moment feeling something. I wasn't sure what that feeling was, but something wasn't quite sitting well. And I was too young to kind of know exactly what I was sort of feeling. But I tell this story because as students, as parents who have students, as educators, we often teach something that I learned from a really young age, that hard work is the secret to success, right? That if you put your head down and you work hard, that the results and sort of success will come, that you'll get those sort of positive outcomes. But what I sort of recognized in that moment, without even being able to pinpoint what it was that there's this notion that hard work alone is not enough. That sometimes hard work leaves you frustrated, that you could take two people who work equally as hard, and one person will ultimately be more successful than the other. And that's because success and outcomes are not always determined just by hard work. That success and outcomes are also determined by things like perceptions and signals and subtle cues and even stereotypes. And so I've seen over the course of my life throughout my career that this has been the case where even though we're taught that hard work is the secret to success, we're even told sometimes, just put your head down, work twice as hard, even if it's for half the amount of benefits, that often leaves people frustrated and burnt out or leaving positions or roles. And as parents, we want to try and teach our kids to work hard and to be gritty, right? We talk so much about hard work and effort and grit. And nowadays we have such a love affair with things like hard work and grit. And yet we still know that deep down, hard work and grit alone are not enough. I would never say that they're not critical. Hard work and grit are absolutely critical. But they're not enough because so much of success and outcomes are determined by perceptions and signals and cues and stereotypes and who you know and what sort of doors are open to you and what types of opportunities you might have. So at the same time, what we see as parents, as educators, as individuals trying to operate this very complex, competitive social landscape is that I see a lot of parents trying to give their kids an advantage. We see stories of parents trying to give their kids an advantage by things like, there's stories of parents who try and buy their kids' ways into universities, colleges and universities, paying people to illegally take their SATs for them, or paying people to, or even on a more legal sense, paying coaches or engaging our kids in extracurricular activities and volunteer opportunities and private coaching and private tutors, right? There's all of these things that we try and do as parents to try and give our kids an advantage. But what a lot of my research shows is that when we try and give our kids an advantage, we do give them an advantage in certain dimensions. But instead, when we try and teach our kids how to cultivate their own edge, we actually give them an advantage in a whole host of range of different dimensions. That instead of giving our kids an advantage, we can teach them how to create their own edge in any sort of context that they're going to be in any sort of environment, or in terms of anything that they're going to be approached with, that they develop the tools to be able to take these perceptions and signals and cues and even stereotypes and be able to flip them in their favor so that they can ultimately create their own advantage and create their own edge. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about here today. And as Charlene mentioned, happy to take any questions that you might have. So even as I'm sort of speaking, if there's any questions that might come up or any thoughts that you have, please feel free to enter them into either the Q&A section or the chat section. So what I want to sort of start with is, this notion that there are positive and negative perceptions that are floating out there all the time, right? So what I find in my research is that based on who you are or what you look like, or even something like someone taking a look at your resume or your biographical sketch or your LinkedIn profile or your transcript, or your list of activities, that people are making perceptions about you as an individual. Sometimes those perceptions are positive. So for an individual, we might see that they belong to a certain club, and we might say, oh, this person's really conscientious and resourceful and committed. But based on that same person belonging to that same club, there might be someone else who bestows upon them very negative perceptions. Things like, oh, this person must be really shallow or deceptive or egotistical, right? So they might belong to future business leaders of America. And there might be one person who's thinking, this person's conscientious and resourceful and committed. And someone else who thinks about that same person with that same background. Oh, this person's really deceitful and shallow and sort of these negative perceptions. So what I find in my research is actually that these positive and negative perceptions are floating out there all the time, but they cluster together in certain categories, such that just like there's a thin line between love and hate, that so too is there a thin line between these positive and negative manifestations, where there are subtle signals and perceptions and cues that I could manipulate situations such that someone who is seen as being conscientious and resourceful and committed could now be seen as someone who was shallow and egotistical, for example, that it would flip these positive manifestations into the negative manifestations of these perceptions. But so too could I manipulate certain situations such that we could take those negative manifestations and flip them so that people were now seen with those positive manifestations, that they were now seen as being conscientious and resourceful and committed. So how does this work? So let me give you an example from my research. For example, I found that there are signals and perceptions all the time that are out there. Signals about someone's gender, race, ethnicity, religion, class, sexual orientation, accent. Also, how much education you have from, what zip code you live in, how much technical experience you have. That all of these perceptions and signals and cues that we make about students based on their activities, based on what they're engaged in, lead to these very differential outcomes. And so for the last decade or so, I've been studying these disparities in outcomes, who succeeds and who doesn't, and what sort of signals and perceptions and cues lead to some people being more likely to, for example, get admission to certain universities, get a raise in their job, get a promotion, get hired into certain positions, getting funding for their ventures, and so on and so forth. And all of these sort of perceptions lead to these disparities and differences. So one example is someone's accent. I found, for example, that people who have accents, or what is considered a non-standard American accent, are much less likely, for example, to be getting into certain universities, to be getting raises, promotions, hired into certain positions, getting funding for their ventures, all sorts of outcomes that I already mentioned. And the lay perception, that there's this lay perception that someone with an accent, that it's because they're not as able to communicate as well, that there's something around their communication skills. But what I did was I tested this lay perception by taking, for example, 4 individuals with accents and 4 individuals without accents, and randomizing the order in which they were interviewing, for example, with a college admissions interviewer. And What I would do is that I would not ask the college admissions interviewer, which of these individuals are you most likely to accept into your college or university? Because I already knew from prior studies that they were much less likely to admit those with accents. Instead, I asked them, just write down 3 bullet points about things you learned about this individual, or things you remember or recall, or things that you found that to be interesting about this individual. And what I found was that they were just as likely actually, in some instances, more likely to be learning things from those with accents and to be recalling and remembering things from those with accents than those who didn't have accents. So it wasn't about communication at all. Instead, what I found was that these individuals with accents were much more likely to get rated lower in terms of things like, how much initiative does this person take? Or how good of a team player is this individual? Or how innovative or out of the box thinking are these individuals? And so what I then did was I would take individuals with accents, and the next time, before they would go interview for a job or admission into a college or university, I would say to them, right before going in, I would say, the perception they have about you is that you don't take as much initiative. Or the perception that they have about you is that you're not as interpersonally influential, or that you're not as good of a team player, or that you're not as creative and out of the box thinking. And they would go into these interviews and I would hear them saying astounding things. I would hear them saying things like, because they would get asked the normal sort of questions like, oh, give me an example of a time when, or tell me about a time when, and they would give examples. I would hear them saying things like, let me tell you about a time when I fought for resources for my team, or I worked with my team in this really clever, creative way. Or let me tell you about this project where we really needed to take initiative and we needed to be able to do so in this really out of the box way. They started giving examples of times when they took initiative, or they were great team players, or they were creative and out of the box thinking. And what I found was not only were they rated much higher in terms of creativity, initiative, being a team player, they were much more likely to gain admission into those colleges and universities, much more likely to get the job, the raise, the promotion, the funding for their ventures. And they were significantly more likely to get rated higher in terms of their communication skills. And they were significantly more likely to get rated lower in terms of how strong of an accent did they have. Something that they didn't even talk about or address over the course of these interviews. That they were able to guide and redirect those perceptions based on understanding what those underlying perceptions of them were. That once they were able to understand those underlying perceptions, that they were able to guide and redirect and navigate and flip those sort of stereotypes in their favor. And that's what these students, that's what these kids, that's what these individuals, that's what employees can do when we teach them how to cultivate their own edge, rather than putting them in situations where we're trying to give them an advantage. Let me give you one more example, and then I want to talk about the edge framework. How do we actually cultivate an edge in these individuals? Another example that I sort of found was not just in terms of these static perceptions or these underlying perceptions that are placed upon us. What I found was that in our interactions, and these are interactions that we're always having with individuals, one type of interaction might be, for example, I ask a question of you and you respond in turn, or you ask a question of me and I respond in turn. What I found is that overwhelmingly in life, that as individuals, students, that we are more likely to get asked one type of question rather than another type of question. So there are two different types of questions that are sort of out there. So for example, imagine you were asked things like, what does success mean to you? Or what's your goal or vision in life? What are you passionate about? Now contrast this with another type of question, things like, what type of people do you feel least comfortable with? what keeps you up at night? Right? So if you think a little bit about these two different types of questions, what's the difference between these questions? Well, you might say that one type is more positive, one's more negative. Or what I find in my research and what we've sort of identified is that these two different types of questions are what are called promotion-oriented questions or prevention-oriented questions, or promotion-focused questions or prevention-focused questions. And what I find is that based on who you are and what you look like and the sort of perceptions and signals and cues and stereotypes that are out there, you are overwhelmingly in life, and students and individuals are more likely to either be getting asked promotion-focused questions or prevention-focused questions. And what happens is that when you get asked a promotion-focused question, you are more likely in turn to respond with a promotion-oriented response. And if you get asked a prevention-focused question, you are more likely to respond in turn with a prevention-oriented response. And this has huge implications for a lot of the outcomes that we look for later in life. So for example, I find that investors and venture capitalists are more likely to ask women or people of color or people with accents or certain educational backgrounds or people with technology backgrounds and high-tech backgrounds. They're more likely to ask these individuals prevention-focused questions. They're more likely to ask things like, how many daily and monthly users do you have? Tell me about your break-even point. Wow, there's a lot of competitors in this space. How are you going to deal with these competitors? And they're more likely to ask men and people with certain educational backgrounds and so on and so forth questions like, what other target customers are you going to go after in the future? Or where can you expand these products to in the future? What are your goals and your objectives in the next 3 to 5 years on how to grow and scale this company? And so at the end of the day, those who are asked those promotion-focused questions, and I know these are a little bit less obvious than the ones that I gave you in the beginning, but again, these are prevention versus promotion-focused questions nonetheless, that you respond in turn. And so at the end of the day, who is the investor going to invest in? Of course, he or she is going to invest in that person who talked about the opportunity and how big they could take something and the potential. And I find the same thing with students when they're interacting with teachers, when they're interacting with people in admissions, where they're interacting with coaches. And this has implications for all sorts of things that we see later on, that investors are much more likely to invest in those who get asked the promotion-focused questions than those who get asked the prevention-focused questions, and also in a host of different contexts. So what do we do about this? Well, what I find is that when you recognize that you're getting asked a prevention-focused question, you answer it, you do answer it, but you do so quickly. And then you flip it to a promotion-oriented response. So in my research, I find that, for example, if someone's getting asked a question like, wow, there are a lot of competitors in this industry, how are you ever going to deal with these competitors? You answer it, you say, yes, there are a lot of competitors, including competitor X and Y and Z. But what our product or service is able to do is all of these things that allow us to then go after new customer segments and expand to new product lines. And there I find that not only do you gain more funding, or you're more likely to get all of those positive outcomes, but you're even more likely to get funding than those who were only asked the promotion-focused questions, that you actually gain an edge over those who only received those prevention-focused questions. And this works in a whole host of different sort of circumstances and outcomes. And so when I study these sort of ways in which we can understand what's happening in our contexts, that's how we ultimately can cultivate and teach our kids and our students and individuals how to gain an edge, how to gain their unique edge. So even though the title of my book is Edge, the E, D, G, and E actually stand for the components of how we teach others and how we ourselves can gain an edge. Where the E stands for enrich, the D stands for delight, the G stands for guide, And the final E stands for effort. That first E, enrich, it's about understanding how we enrich and provide value in any sort of circumstance that we're going to be in. It's about teaching our kids and our students, how do they enrich? How do they provide value? What are the strengths, the weaknesses, the underestimated strengths, the superpowers that they have? But it's more than just sort of that self-awareness piece. It's about cultivating and honing their ability to understand that no matter what situation they're going to be in, those perceptions of how they enrich and provide value are going to shift and change. That you change any variable. You change the industry that you're operating in, or you change the mix of people that you're interacting with, or you change the subject that you're taking the class in, and those perceptions of how you enrich and provide value are going to change. So it's about honing that intuition, being able to hone that ability for them to perceive and understand those underlying perceptions that are being bestowed upon them. The D stands for delight, which is to say that a lot of times we don't have the opportunity to show how we enrich and provide value because we don't belong to the right networks, or we don't know the right people, or we just don't have the opportunities to do so. When we're able to understand how we uniquely delight, regardless of delighting a customer or a supplier or a partner or a teacher or a counterpart in any sort of situation that we're going to be in, when we understand how we uniquely delight others, that's the equivalent of being able to crack that door open just a little bit. So we have the opportunity to show how we enrich and provide value. The G stands for guide, which is to say that even when we enrich and delight, that we constantly and continuously need to be guiding the perceptions that others have about us, guiding them to who we authentically are, guiding and flipping and redirecting these perceptions and signals and cues and stereotypes when they're not leading us to those situations where success and positive outcomes are going to result. And the final E stands for effort and hard work, which is to say that effort and hard work come last in this framework. We often think it comes first, that if we put in that hard work, it'll speak for itself. But even though it's critical, and it is super critical because it is one of the 4 components, each of these 4 is a section of my book. And I devote an entire section to effort and hard work. So it is critical, but it comes last. Because when we know how we enrich and delight and guide, that's when our effort and hard work actually work harder for us. That's when we get those tailwinds. That's when, instead of working twice as hard for half the amount of benefits, why work twice as hard for half the amount of benefits when you can work twice as hard for twice the amount of benefits, or even 3 times the amount of benefits? That's what you get when you know how you enrich and delight and guide, so that your effort and hard work can work harder for you. And in this EDGE framework, we can teach our kids, we can teach our students, we can teach how to cultivate your own edge in an authentic way, so that it is not about impression management or being strategic. It is being about how you're authentically enriching and providing value, so that it's not about giving an advantage. It's about teaching how to cultivate that edge in any sort of circumstance that we're going to be in. And this is what I sometimes feel like is the gap between what we're teaching in schools and what we're sort of missing in terms of hard work and that knowledge and what we know, and taking that hard work and that knowledge and making it hard work plus. Bridging that gap between what we teach in school and understanding how things work in terms of perceptions and signals and subtle signals and cues and stereotypes, so that we can gain and create that edge for ourselves. So thank you so much for joining me here today. There are so many different resources that as we're sort of, please let me know if you have any questions, happy to take any questions as we're sort of waiting for those questions to come in. So many resources that I want to share with you if you'd like to learn more. I have a free sort of 15-page guide that accompanies my book that you can download that talks a lot about, oh, thanks, Charlene, that talks lots more about sort of the practical implications of this. So if you go to my website, laurahuang.net, I have a monthly newsletter, a quiz that you can take and your kids and your students can take around how well equipped are they for already sort of honing and developing this edge. So lots of resources on my website. I also have a nonprofit called Project EMplify.org, EMplify, projectemplify.org, where I try and we have 3 pieces to this. We have a book matching program, free workshops, and as well as a mentoring program where we match people up with mentors to try and continue to help people cultivate their edge. And of course, lots of other resources all over social media. I'm Laura Huang, LA on Instagram, on Twitter. So those of you who are more social media oriented, Laura Huang, LA. So thank you so much and happy to take any questions. Turning it back to you, Charlene.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. I have tons of questions, but we have some great questions coming in. So let's just get started. Again, I really highly recommend this book. It's a great read, Laura. And you've touched on those different chapters and the areas that stand for the acronym EDGE, but they're all important. So let me see if we can get to some of the content. I also want to thank Kepler's Books here in Menlo Park, which is an independent bookseller. We ordered books through them that will be donated, and we really appreciate that. Kepler's, thank you. And my partner Bev has put in the chat a link to Kepler's page. It's a landing page for Laura's book, so you can order directly there, okay? And she's even signed.
And I think Kepler has autographed versions as well. So
they do. They have autographed book plates. All right. So let's start here. Laura, when did you first recognize the value of edge? Was there a defining moment or a pattern that you saw that encouraged you to do this research?
It's so funny that you mentioned this pattern, right? Because I talk a lot about in my research and with my students, as well as in my book, about this notion that life rhymes, right? So you think about like rhyming, like words rhyme, life rhymes. And what I found throughout growing up and throughout like my journey is that there were so many situations where life would rhyme. It might be with different people, different contexts, but there was the same sort of overarching feeling, or there was something that didn't quite sit right. There was something that was like still nagging at me. And one of those things was that there is this myth of meritocracy, that we live in this sort of imperfect world. And so many of the solutions that I sort of saw to this myth of meritocracy were systemic or system level solutions. Things like, well, let's have more equitable interviewing processes. Let's have checklists to help us interview. Let's even have algorithms to be more fair. Or let's try and address the leaky pipeline. Let's try and have more mentors who are women and people of color. Let's try and make schools and education more equitable and more well-rounded. All of these things that were from the outside in. But what I found in my research was that this was often leaving parents and students even more frustrated, because it was as if we were saying to them, just wait. We know that it's an imperfect system. We know that there's a myth of meritocracy. Just wait as we try and fix it. And there wasn't a lot that individuals from the inside out could be doing to sort of be taking their own lives and be empowering themselves. And so the last couple of years of my research and what went into this book was, how can we empower individuals and parents and students and educators and people in the workforce to be empowering themselves even within an imperfect system? Are there ways that we could be doing things from the inside out to be addressing stereotypes and perceptions and signals and cues and all of these sort of soft implicit factors that vis-a-vis hard factors might be playing a large role. And so even though a lot of these systemic system level solutions are a step in the right direction, right? We should be trying to be more equitable in our hiring practices and our interviewing practice and all that we had things that we could do to give ourselves that edge from the inside out, even as we are sort of trying to do things from the outside in.
That makes perfect sense, Laura. Really, that's a lot to think about. I really like that answer. So we have a few questions coming in about the pandemic and how it impacts our students right now. I'm sure you have children of your own. I'm sure you've thought about this. So one parent writes, my son's in the 3rd grade. He's still doing online learning. A lot of his friends have gone back to in-person school. How can we help him turn this challenging situation into an advantage and not a trauma?
Such a great question, right? And again, like there's so much adversity and obstacles and constraints that we're sort of facing from the current circumstances. You know, so much of this is that we don't necessarily think about things as a continuum, right? So I talk lots about trajectories and things as a continuum. We have this tendency to think about things like there's X and there's Y, and these two things are sort of pitted against each other, right? We're learning online or we're learning in person, but there's this entire continuum. And so this is a great opportunity to help your son, even kids and students that are as young as 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, sort of understand dichotomies and understand continuums. And being able to sort of say that learning online is not the counterpoint to learning in person, that there are ways in which we can think about learning online and being able to understand this in certain ways, right? So that's sort of the first piece of this. But the second piece of this is not just sort of thinking about the opportunities. How do we think about, because certainly there are like, what opportunities, what are the silver linings? What's positive about this? Well, again, when we often try and think about, even though the title of my book, right, we even have turning adversity into advantage. Not every adversity has to be turned into an advantage in the same way. What I mean by this is, I hear a lot of people saying like, how can we see this as an opportunity? Well, a lot of times when we say that, we then think about opportunities as having to be opportunistic, that there has to be some sort of positive in this. Well, learning online versus learning in the classroom, thinking about it and repositioning instead of opportunities, what are the inefficiencies? How do we think about this in terms of what are the inefficiencies that we can address? So again, even with the 3rd grader or a 2nd grader or a 1st grader, we can talk about things like, well, what wasn't right about education? What were we missing? What were things that we didn't even have before we even went into this? Before we even went into this, are we learning online? Are we learning in the classroom sort of thing? What wasn't right about what, and what have we now improved based on being in the classroom? What have we now improved by being online? What hasn't changed at all? What continues to be a problem? And helping your son or your daughter understanding all of those sort of inefficiencies, and how do we sort of address these inefficiencies. So I'll give you a quick example, a very practical example. I know we have tons of questions and this is such a long answer already, but things like, you know, there's so many opportunities now where in the past it was like, people would say like, oh, next time you're in New York, let me know, we'll have coffee. Next time you're in San Francisco, let me know, we'll have coffee, right? And what I started telling my students is like, you're never going to be having that coffee for at least a year or 2 years because you're just not going to be. But so this is a great opportunity to reach out and be like, oh, remember how we said we were going to grab coffee? Well, let's do this instead. Let's do this, right? Let's try and have, and this is something that you can be doing even with your kids. Where are those opportunities? Where are those inefficiencies that you can be addressing in different ways? In what ways can you be making this a spectacular opportunity, teaching your son or daughter about the fact that when you're online, you have this great opportunity to have like notes next to you, or examples on the ready, or things that you can dynamically be putting in where you can't do that in person. So all of those sort of things. Again, I know there's like so much I want to say. There's like like 3 sessions of like course material that I want to say in terms of this, but I tried to fit into a 5-minute answer. I hope that was helpful.
Absolutely. We have a couple questions coming in, Laura, for parents that have kids with learning differences like ADHD, a parent with a 9-year-old with a recent diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. How do you turn those differences into an advantage? And is society ready to look at like neurodiverse kids and their strengths, focus, whatever it may be?
Absolutely. So this is such a great question because there are so many stereotypes and assumptions that we have about learning disabilities, ADHD, all of these sort of things that, if your child is on a like individualized learning plan, any of these sort of things, there are these perceptions that are made upon them. And so what I find is I actually have like one entire chapter where I insult everyone, like everyone in the world, because I talk about stereotypes, right? So I talk about stereotypes of like, if you're a woman, these are the stereotypes. If you're a person of color, here are the stereotypes. If you've got learning disabilities, here are the stereotypes. If you're a woman who's a person of color with learning disabilities, here are the stereotypes that we have about you. So I insult everyone. And what I talk about is a lot of times these are the baseline, right? There is a big sort of like 60 to 70% of perceptions and assumptions that people make based on these sort of stereotypes that, oh, your son or daughter has ADHD, or that. So these are like 60 to 70% of the initial perceptions that they're going to have about them. But there's a huge 30 to 40% that is based on who your son or daughter is as an individual. That goes beyond any sort of diagnoses or any sort of labels or anything that's placed upon them. So it's understanding, again, those lay perceptions that they're going to have. Because I could take myself, right, an Asian woman professor, and take another Asian woman professor, and there would be very, very different perceptions that are being bestowed upon us. The same, I could take third grader who has ADHD and another third grader who has ADHD, and there'd be very different perceptions that are being bestowed upon them. And so the coaching, the teaching, the helping them understand is helping them understand not only that 60 to 70% foundation of where those stereotypes come from, but also helping them to understand that 30 to 40% that is about who they are as an individual. Again, how they enrich and provide value. And in my book, I have tons of different like questions you can ask your students, questions you can ask your children, ways that you can help think through all of those pieces. And when you sort of combine that, that's when you're able to truly guide and redirect to who you authentically are and that sort of value you provide. Those gifts, those underestimated strengths, redirecting and flipping it to those gifts that each individual does have.
All right, great advice. So let's turn to the D, delight, for just a minute. Laura, this parent asks, it's a legitimate question. A lot of parents have this question. What if your child is not particularly engaging, funny, or delightful? Was there ever a time in your life when you could not delight? Our family tends to be a little serious.
Yeah, oh my gosh. So delight is like, so a lot of times we think about delight as something that's like positive and charismatic and all of these sort of things. What I talk about in the delight section of my book and what I find about my research is that could not be farther from the truth. Delight is not about, so I'll give you a really quick, oh gosh, I know we don't have a lot of time, but let me give you a quick, like delight is very hard to sort of bottle up and understand what this is about, right? So like the example I like to give sometimes is like, think about the very first time you rode in an Uber. The very first time you were in an Uber, right? I know that we're not riding in Ubers these days as much. And like, there's lots of sort of things we think about in terms of when I say the word Uber in terms of like management issues and all these sort of things. But just think for a really quick second, the very first time you're in an Uber, for me anyways, it was this feeling of like, whoa, what is going on? Like, this is so cool, but terrifying, right? Like I'm in a stranger's car, like they know where I live. They're just going to take me to where I'm going to go. I'm not going to hand them over any money. I'm in their car, right? That's delight. It doesn't necessarily have to be positive or negative. It can even be terrifying, but it causes you to stop for a second. You stop for a second and you think about like even just 5 seconds, and you want to either like learn more or ask another question. It stops the music because you're now considering something in a different way. That's when you have the opportunity to enrich or delight or delight further or show how you guide or what the case might be. You're just cracking the door open for yourself. And I'm someone who's not naturally, like I'm naturally introverted. As I mentioned before, growing up, I was like not musical, not athletic, painfully shy, didn't have a lot of friends, right? Was never able to delight. And I start my book off with this story about how I was kicked out of a individual's office, this one of the wealthiest men in the world. I was kicked out of his office within 30 seconds of having this meeting. And I talk about how I was able to sort of delight and gain an edge over this individual. And the way I delighted, I'll give away a little bit of the story, was not anything elegant or charismatic or anything, that I was like nervous. And so what I do when I'm nervous is I like nervously giggle, like I nervously laugh, like I'm sort of, and that was like enough to sort of stop the music and sort of open that door a little bit. And so I won't give away that story, but you can read that story around. And in the delight section, I talk about all of the different ways that we uniquely delight. We uniquely delight, and we all have it in us. It's about understanding our tendencies and our habits and our strengths and our weaknesses, and understanding what's that catalyst that allows us to sort of stop the music, crack that door open a little bit, so that we do get questions or somebody considers us in a slightly different way, regardless of whether we've just met them or if we've known them for 10 years, that allows us to really gain that edge.
That's amazing. See, parents, you really have to read this book because some of these differences are subtle, right? You really have to read it. And it's worth it just for that opening story, especially here in Silicon Valley, I swear.
I think that's why it's so, because it's subtle, that's why I sort of see in my research this big contrast between, we try so hard to give our kids an advantage, but we can never give our kids an advantage in all of these different realms or all of these different dimensions that they're going to be engaged in their lives. And because it's subtle, if we can give them this perspective, they can understand the nuances and the subtleties and be able to be on their own and be able to develop these advantages without the need for us as parents or educators or so on.
All right, so we have time for just a couple more. This, I think, is a great question. Laura, this parent asks, if you were the parent of that you in the math class working so hard to get that gold star, what would you do and how would you support that teenager?
It's so funny because like I mentioned earlier how like life rhymes, right? And my parents, I came from, my parents were immigrants. They had no idea sort of what the educational school system was like. But I had a number of different situations that sort of made me feel that same way that I felt in that math class, right? And so thinking about how I would support that teenager, let me give you a couple of other sort of short anecdotes where I mean like life kind of rhymes. So when I was even younger, when I was very, very young, when I was in second or third grade, one of my teachers came to me and she said, something really shocking has happened. I don't know what's happened, but you tested really high on the standardized test. And again, I came from, this very like blue collar, public school district. And they said, based on your standardized test scores, we took the Iowa test, which was a test that you took every year. You're supposed to be in our school's gifted and talented program, but we've never had a student test in through test scores. It's always been through teacher recommendations. So there must be some mistake. So they made me they're like, we need you to take more tests. So I took more tests. And again, they were like, wow, okay, so we don't know what's going on, but again, you scored high enough. And they invited my parents in and they said, we don't know what's happening. And so finally what ended up getting decided was, well, you know what, we're gonna put Laura in gifted and talented just for math. not for English and language arts, even though I had scored equally.
You tested it.
And they were like, because she doesn't really speak English. And there's no way that we can put her, and this was the first time that they had ever taken a student and split them from the normal, so that I was getting pulled out of class just for math, put back into normal class for other subjects. And so it was only math that I was allowed to be in this gifted and talented program for. And then sort of this experience and the math experience. And then when I was in college, when I was in university, we had to take this university writing class. All college freshmen had to take this at Duke. And so it was this university writing class where you had, every week you had to write an essay, and the professor would sort of grade it and give you feedback. And the very first essay that I wrote, the very first writing assignment, I got like a D- or an F on, I forget, it was a failing grade. And I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, why, like, this is like one of my first classes in university. How could I have gotten a failing grade? So I went up to the professor and similar, I said, can you help me understand, like, how did I get this D- or F? And he said to me, he said, oh, it's fine because you don't really speak English and your native language is in English. It's understandable that you're not going to do well, but that's what the point of this course is about. This point of this course is to help you learn how to be a writer and learn how to. And so I remember, again, feeling that same feeling. And so what I did for the next essay was I wrote the entire writing assignment about how this class was going to be like my salvation, and I was going to learn so much about English and writing and all these things. And the professor detected none of my sarcasm at all about like how like this class was going to like teach me how to speak and learn English and learn how to write and all of these sort of things. And I ended up getting a B-. And as like time went on, I sort of like, and so that's what I would, that's what I would as a parent, and that's what went into so much of my research, which is that we sometimes think that it's about like advocacy, that we need to go in there and say like, I know it's because I'm a woman that you think X, Y, and Z, or I know it's because I have an accent that you think X, Y, and Z. But what I find is that the immediate reaction then is something like, oh, no, I would never think that, even if that's exactly what they think. So when we can understand those underlying perceptions and find ways to guide and redirect, even if we're wrong, there's no harm, no foul. There are ways that we can authentically be showing, because there was nothing that I could sort of do in any of those situations. I was dealing with someone who was of higher power, of higher status, that I still couldn't just leave. Like, these were principals of schools, teachers, these were professors, these were people who I had to learn how to. And so as a parent of teenagers, it's about teaching how to take that sort of anger or frustration and channeling it in ways that allow you to not just take whatever you're getting, like you should still be fighting, and we want to teach our kids to be fighters, but how do you actually make that hard work harder for you? How do you take grit? It's not just about having grit, but what are the ways in which we can understand grit in these different contexts? Because for lots of the sort of students and children out there, you are not going to have the same unique challenges that I had, or that some of my research subjects have. We're all going to have our individual ones. So understanding this perspective, the more unique we make it to us, the more we're going to be able to gain a true, long-lasting like edge for ourselves.
Absolutely. And everyone is subjected to some kind of bias, right? It's not the same for everyone, but there always is something. So Laura, you've given us so much tonight. Any last words for parents, a final thing that you just really want people to know?
Yeah. I mean, I think you sort of started to say that before, is like, everyone has something. I talk about this. Everyone has something. It doesn't matter who you are. You could be the epitome of like white cis male privilege coming from lots and lots of money. Like everyone has something. And so the more we can empower ourselves, you really can do this. The thing that bothers me so much is when we do place labels. We say, oh, this person has ADHD, or this person's not good at math. Oh, this person's like never going to have a future because of X, because of Y. But there's so much out there that we can really understand in terms of how we can gain an edge. And so that's what so much of my work has spoken to, and that I continue to want to do more research on, is how can we take these these perceptions, how can we take our unique circumstances and really flip them to our advantage, empower ourselves so that we can see the gifts and we can achieve all of those things that we want to. We're not just pounding our head. We're not just like pulling the same levers over and over and over again, that there are ways for us to achieve those outcomes and that fulfillment that we are sort of looking for. So thank you so much, Charlene. This has been great. I hope you all enjoyed this. And yeah, thanks again.
Thank you so much, Professor Laura Huang. We can see why your classes are so popular. Again, highly recommend her book to hear more. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Take care, everybody. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Keplers. Thank you to our sponsors. Stay well and hope to see you all soon. Good night, everybody.